The light in the El Escorial palace falls in pale rectangles across the tiled floor, illuminating motes of dust that have settled here for centuries. In a chamber hung with tapestries depicting the victories of Catholic kings, a 4-year-old boy kneels before a priest, his small hands clasped in prayer, his eyes fixed on the crucifix above the altar. When he rises, the priest catches his breath. The boy's lower jaw juts forward so dramatically that his teeth cannot meet. His tongue sits too large for his mouth, and his words emerge as wet, struggling sounds that his mother alone can understand. The year is 1665, and this boy is Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg king, the product of 2 centuries of dynastic marriage, and the living proof that an empire can be destroyed by blood as surely as by sword. His mother watches him from the shadows, her face unreadable. She knows what the court whispers, that the boy is too frail to live, too damaged to rule, too cursed to continue the line. But she also knows that he is all that stands between her family and the extinction of their Spanish throne. The boy coughs, a wet sound that echoes in the silent room, and the priest crosses himself. To trace the curve of that chin is to trace the rise and fall of the most powerful dynasty Europe has ever known. The winter of 1477 bites deep into the bones of Burgundy, but the young man who rides through the gates of Ghent barely notices the cold. He is 18 years old, tall for his age, with the fair hair and pale eyes of his German ancestors. His name is Maximilian of Austria, son of the Holy Roman Emperor, and he has come to claim a bride he has never met and a fortune he has only dreamed of. The city that welcomes him is the richest in northern Europe. Burgundy, under its dukes, has become a marvel of commerce and culture, weaving towns that produce the finest cloth, ports that trade with England and Italy, courts that rival Paris for elegance. The young woman who waits for him in the palace, Mary of Burgundy, is the greatest heiress of the age. 19 years old, already ruling her domains, sought after by every prince in Europe. Maximilian dismounts in the courtyard, stamps his feet against the cold, and looks up at the windows where he knows she watches. He does not love her, he does not know her, but he knows that this marriage will change everything. The Habsburgs, until now a minor noble family from the Swiss Alps, will vault into the first rank of European power. The wedding, when it comes, is not a union of hearts. It is a transaction in blood. The ceremony takes place in the cathedral, amid tapestries and torchlight. Maximilian, resplendent in white and gold, watches his bride approach. Mary is beautiful, auburn hair, intelligent eyes, the grace of a woman raised to rule. She walks toward him slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment before her freedom ends. She knows what this marriage means, the end of Burgundian independence, the absorption of her lands into the Habsburg orbit. But she also knows that she has no choice. A woman alone cannot defend her inheritance against the King of France, who already claims her territories. She needs Maximilian's sword, he needs her gold. When the priest joins their hands, the contract is sealed. Maximilian speaks his vows in French, a language he barely knows, stumbling over the words. Mary smiles, a small private smile that the chroniclers will note but never explain. Is she amused by his accent, resigned to her fate, hopeful for the future? No one knows. The moment passes, the choir sings, and the new couple processes into the night. In the shadows at the back of the cathedral, an old man watches with hooded eyes. He is a court physician from Vienna, sent by Maximilian's father to observe the union. He notes the shape of the bride's chin, the set of her jaw, the curve of her lips. He will record these observations in a leather-bound book, noting that the Duchess appears healthy, her features regular, her blood unpolluted by the deformities that sometimes plague noble families. The book will travel back to Vienna, where it will be studied, compared, filed away. No one will look at it again for 500 years. The marriage produces children quickly. Philip, called the Fair for his golden beauty, is born in 1478. Margaret follows in 1480. The births are celebrated with tournaments and feasts, with Te Deums in the cathedrals and fireworks over the canals. The dynasty has begun its work, producing heirs, securing the line, spreading the blood across the thrones of Europe. But the work has costs. Mary dies in 1482, thrown from a horse while hunting. She is 25 years old. Maximilian, who has learned to love her in their brief years together, mourns sincerely, but he also calculates. The children are safe. The inheritance is secure. The marriage has done its work. He will marry again for political advantage and again and again. The dynasty requires it. Philip the Fair grows up in Burgundy, raised by Flemish nobles who resent Habsburg control. He learns French, Dutch, and a smattering of German, enough to command, not enough to think deeply. He is beautiful, charming, utterly convinced of his own destiny. When he comes of age, his father arranges another marriage, another transaction. Philip will marry Joanna, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs who are uniting Spain. The wedding takes place in 1496 in the cathedral at Lyre. Philip is 18, Joanna 17. He is fair, she is dark. He is confident, she is intense. The chroniclers note that they seem genuinely attracted to each other, that the transaction shows signs of becoming something more. But they also note something else. The slight prominence of Joanna's lower jaw, a trait she shares with her mother's family, the Trastamaras. It is not yet the famous Habsburg jaw, that will come later, but it is there, a ghost at the feast, a hint of what intermarriage will produce. Joanna's mother, Isabella of Castile, has her own reasons for approving the match. She has united Spain through war and marriage, driven the Moors from Granada, sponsored Columbus's voyage to the unknown West. She knows that her daughter's marriage to Philip will bring Spain into the European mainstream, linking the new world she is building to the old world of Burgundy and Austria. She kisses Joanna goodbye at the port of Llerdo, watching the ships carry her daughter north, and she weeps, not for the loss, but for the uncertainty. The sea is treacherous, the north is cold. The girl she sends may not be the woman who returns. Joanna never returns. She will spend the rest of her life in the north, first as wife, then as widow, then as prisoner. Her marriage to Philip produces 6 children, heirs to half the thrones of Europe, but it also produces something else, the first clear signs of the mental instability that will haunt her descendants. Joanna laughs too loud, cries too easily, loves too intensely. When Philip dies suddenly in 1506, probably of typhoid, she refuses to let his body be buried. She travels with his coffin for months, opening it occasionally to kiss his feet, to check for signs of decay, to assure herself that he will return. The court whispers that she is mad. Her father, Ferdinand, has her confined to a convent, where she will live for another 46 years, alone with her memories and her grief. But her children survive. Her son Charles, born in 1500, inherits everything: Burgundy from his father, Spain from his mother, Austria from his grandfather. When he comes of age, he rules the greatest empire since Rome, and he bears on his face the mark of his heritage, the jaw that will define his family, the chin that juts forward just enough to notice, the trait that will become more pronounced with every generation. Charles V, as history knows him, is the first Habsburg to confront the family curse. His jaw is not yet grotesque. He can chew, speak, close his mouth without effort, but it is noticeable. Courtiers comment on it politely in their letters. Diplomats note it in their dispatches. Portraits soften it, painting him in profile or shadow, hiding the evidence that will one day condemn his descendants. Charles himself seems unconcerned. He has too much to do: wars with France, the Protestant Reformation, the advance of the Ottoman Turks, to worry about the shape of his chin. He rules from horseback, crossing Europe with an army of bureaucrats and soldiers, imposing order on chaos. He is the universal monarch, the emperor on whom the sun never sets, and he believes that King has chosen him for this work. But even Charles cannot escape the logic of dynasty. He marries his cousin Isabella of Portugal, continuing the pattern of intermarriage that his ancestors began. Their son Philip, born in 1527, will inherit Spain, the Netherlands, and the Italian possessions. Their brother Ferdinand will inherit Austria and the imperial title. The family divides, but the blood remains the same, and the jaw, that stubborn marker of kinship, grows more prominent with each generation. In 1556, Charles abdicates. He is 56 years old, exhausted by decades of rule, broken by gout and disappointment. He retires to the monastery of Yuste, in the mountains of Extremadura, where he spends his last years in a strange obsession: clocks. He collects them, studies them, tries to make them run in perfect synchrony. He cannot stop tinkering, adjusting, correcting. The clocks, like his empire, like his family, will not hold their order. They tick and chime in glorious confusion, a cacophony of time. On September 21, 1558, Charles dies. His body is opened for embalming, and the physicians note something strange. His heart is small, shrunken, almost desiccated. They do not know what this means. They do not know that the same blood that gave him an empire also carried the seeds of its destruction. In the palace at Valladolid, his son Philip receives the news with the stoicism his father taught him. He kneels in prayer, orders masses for the soul of the emperor, and returns to work. There is always work. There are always enemies. There is always the next marriage, the next heir, the next step in the endless dance of dynasty. Philip writes to his uncle Ferdinand in Vienna, informing him of their father's death. He signs the letter with the family motto, the words that have guided the Habsburgs for generations. Austriae est imperia orbi universo. It is Austria's destiny to rule the world. He does not know that the destiny he celebrates is already turning against him. The jaw that marked his father marks him more clearly. The cousins who marry cousins will produce children who cannot survive. The blood that unites the family will also destroy it. In the convent of Tordesillas, a woman who was once called Joanna the Mad sits by a window, staring at nothing. She has been here for 50 years, forgotten by the world she once ruled. She does not know that her grandson is emperor, that her blood runs through the veins of kings. She does not know anything anymore. She only waits, patient as stone, for the death that will not come. The dynasty rolls on, oblivious to the ghosts in its blood. The marriages continue, the jaws grow longer, and in the darkness of the family vaults, the bones of 1,000 Habsburgs lie stacked like cordwood, waiting for the scientists who will read their secrets. The torchlight catches the edge of his jaw, throwing a shadow across the wall that seems larger than life. Philip II of Spain kneels before the high altar of the El Escorial, his face raised to the crucifix, his lips moving in silent prayer. He is 50 years old, dressed in black from head to foot, the color he has worn since his father's death and will wear until his own. His jaw, more pronounced than his father's, forces his mouth into a perpetual slight opening, as if he is always about to speak but never quite begins. The El Escorial is his creation, his obsession, his monument to king and dynasty. It rises from the barren hills outside Madrid, a vast complex of granite and slate, palace and monastery, basilica and mausoleum. Philip has built it to house the bones of his family, to provide a worthy resting place for the Habsburgs who came before and those who will come after. He visits the construction site daily, inspecting the work, correcting the masons, ensuring that every stone meets his exacting standards. Nothing escapes him, nothing ever has. In the crypt below, the coffins are already arriving. His father, Charles V, lies in temporary repose, waiting for the vault to be finished. His mother, Isabella of Portugal, waits beside him. His wives, he has had 4, will join them in time. His children, those who survive, will fill the remaining niches. The El Escorial will become the necropolis of a dynasty, the place where Habsburg bones rest, while Habsburg heirs rule above. Philip descends the stairs to the crypt, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He runs his hand along the lid of his father's coffin, feeling the cold wood, remembering the man who taught him to rule. Charles V gave him an empire: Spain, the Netherlands, Milan, Naples, the Americas. He also gave him a burden, the defense of the true faith against heretics, infidels, and rebels. Philip has spent his life carrying that burden. He will die carrying it. The court of Philip II is the most rigid in Europe. Every gesture is prescribed, every word weighed, every glance noted. The king himself sets the standard. He rises early, works late, trusts no one. He reads every dispatch, signs every document, makes every decision. His ministers are clerks, not advisors. His nobles are ornaments, not counselors. He rules alone from his desk, with the patience of a spider and the piety of a monk. His jaw, the family mark, complicates everything. It makes his speech slightly slurred, his expressions hard to read. Diplomats learn to watch his hands instead of his face, to read his mood in the movement of his fingers. They note that he drums them when impatient, folds them when thoughtful, grips the armrest when angry. The jaw reveals nothing. The hands reveal everything. In 1580, Philip adds Portugal to his domains, inheriting through his mother's line. The peninsula is united for the first time since the Romans, and Philip rules from Lisbon as well as Madrid. He celebrates with a solemn mass in the cathedral, surrounded by the nobles of both kingdoms. The Portuguese, watching their new king, note the jaw. They whisper that he looks more like his mother's family, the Portuguese Aves, than his father's. But the jaw is Habsburg, unmistakably Habsburg, the mark of the house that will not let go. In Vienna, Philip's uncle Ferdinand rules the Austrian branch of the family. The cousins correspond regularly, letters in cipher that take weeks to travel across Europe. They discuss marriages, always marriages, the endless negotiation of brides and dowries, the careful calculus of blood. Ferdinand's son Charles marries Philip's daughter Maria, a union of uncle and niece that would shock the church if the church did not need Habsburg gold. The dispensation arrives from Rome, signed and sealed, and the wedding proceeds. The bride is 14, the groom is 30. She cries during the ceremony, tears streaming down her face as the priest binds her to a man she barely knows. Her father, watching from the front row, feels nothing. He has married for policy himself 4 times and knows that duty requires sacrifice. The girl will learn, they all learn. When the marriage is consummated, the court physicians examine the bride for signs of fertility. They note that her jaw, like her father's, is prominent, that her teeth do not meet, that her speech is slightly impaired. They record these observations in their books, alongside notes about her menstrual cycle, her diet, her general health. They do not connect the jaw to the blood. They do not know that the trait they observe is a warning, a signal, a ghost at the feast. Philip's children die. One by one, they succumb to fevers, to accidents, to the mysterious wasting diseases that carry off infants in the night. His first son, Don Carlos, is sickly from birth, his jaw so deformed that he cannot chew, his mind so unstable that he attacks servants and sets fires. Philip has him confined to a tower, where he dies after 6 months of solitary imprisonment. The court whispers that Philip ordered his son killed. The truth is less dramatic and more tragic. Don Carlos simply stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped living. He was 23 years old. Philip's fourth wife, his niece Anna of Austria, finally gives him the heir he needs. Philip III is born in 1578, healthy and strong, his jaw already visible in the shape of his face. Philip II holds the infant in his arms, studying the small features, searching for signs of the family curse. He sees the jaw, of course, it is unmistakable, but he also sees life, vigor, the promise of continuation. He hands the child to the nurses and returns to his desk. There is always work. In 1598, Philip II dies in the El Escorial, surrounded by monks and physicians. His body is placed in the crypt beside his father, his mother, his wives, his children. The vault is nearly full now, but there is room for more. There will always be more. The dynasty requires it. Philip III inherits a world his father built and a jaw his father bequeathed. He is 20 years old, handsome in a brooding way, with the Habsburg chin already pronounced enough to shape his profile. Unlike his father, he has no interest in ruling. He delegates everything to his favorite, the Duke of Lerma, and retreats into piety and pleasure. The Spanish Empire drifts, leaderless, while Lerma enriches himself and his family. The jaw grows more prominent with each generation. Philip II's children, born of his marriage to his cousin Margaret of Austria, show the trait clearly. His daughter Anna, who will become Queen of France, has a jaw that the French courtiers notice and discuss. His son Philip, the future Philip IV, has a jaw that makes eating difficult and speech a trial. The family portraits, painted by Velázquez, soften the feature, painting the king in three-quarter view, hiding the evidence of decline. But the evidence accumulates. In Vienna, the Austrian Habsburgs follow the same pattern, cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, the blood circling back on itself. The family tree, once a spreading oak, becomes a twisted vine, branches looping back to the trunk, leaves growing from the same stem. The geneticists of the future will calculate the inbreeding coefficient and find numbers that stagger the imagination. The Habsburgs are not merely intermarried. They are almost a single organism, reproducing with itself. In 1618, the 30 Years' War begins. It will consume Germany, devastate Europe, and kill millions. The Habsburgs, both Spanish and Austrian, fight on the same side, defending the Catholic faith and their dynastic interests against Protestants, French, and Swedes. The war lasts 30 years, outlasting emperors and kings, and when it ends, the Habsburgs have lost. Not decisively, they survive, they rule, but the dream of universal monarchy, the dream Charles V embodied, is dead. The jaw survives. It grows longer with each generation, more pronounced, more disabling. Philip IV of Spain, the great patron of arts, the king who Velázquez painted again and again, cannot close his mouth. His teeth, those that remain, are rotting from constant exposure to air. He eats soft foods, speaks with difficulty, and hides his face behind his hand when he must appear in public. The portraits show a handsome man, dignified and remote. The reality is a man in pain, a man ashamed, a man trapped in the body his ancestors built for him. He marries his niece, Mariana of Austria, continuing the pattern. Their children die one after another until only one survives, a boy named Charles, born in 1661, sickly from the moment of his birth. His jaw is the worst yet, so extreme that his teeth cannot meet, his tongue cannot fit, his face cannot close. He is 4 years old when his father dies, and he becomes Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain. The dynasty that began with a marriage pact, that rose to rule the world, that built the El Escorial to house its bones, that dynasty now rests on the shoulders of a child who cannot chew his own food. The courtiers look at him and see the future. They do not like what they see. But the future does not care what they like. It comes anyway, patient as stone, carrying the jaw like a banner, like a curse, like a promise kept. The child arrives in the world on a cold November morning in 1661, and the moment he draws his first breath, the women attending his mother cross themselves. They have seen many royal births, the blood, the cries, the small wriggling creatures that emerge from the darkness, but they have never seen anything like this. The boy's head is too large, his limbs too thin, his face a mask of deformity. Most alarming of all, his lower jaw juts forward so dramatically that his tongue lolls from his mouth like a dog panting on a summer day. Charles II of Spain has entered the world, and the world holds its breath. His mother, Mariana of Austria, lies exhausted in the bloody sheets, her face turned to the wall. She has given birth to 5 children before this one. 4 are dead. She knows that this boy, this strange creature with the impossible jaw, is her last chance. If he dies, the Spanish Habsburgs die with him. She turns from the wall and reaches for the child, pulling him to her breast, feeling his tiny heart beat against her own. He will live, she decides. He must live. The physicians gather for a consultation. They examine the infant from crown to toe, measuring, prodding, knotting. They write their observations in careful Latin, recording the shape of the skull, the position of the jaw, the number of teeth, too many, crowded together, some already rotting. They do not know what causes these deformities. They do not know that the child before them is the product of generations of intermarriage, that his parents are uncle and niece, that his family tree has more loops than branches. They know only that he is sickly, that he may not survive, that they must do everything in their power to keep him alive. They bleed him, they purge him, they pray over him, they cover him in relics and amulets, hoping that saints will succeed where medicine fails. The child cries constantly, a thin wail that echoes through the palace corridors, a sound that will become the soundtrack of his reign. Charles grows but barely. At 5, he is the size of a 3-year-old, unable to walk without support, unable to speak more than a few slurred words. His jaw, the famous Habsburg jaw, dominates his face, a massive protrusion that forces his mouth open, his teeth apart, his tongue forward. He drools constantly, the saliva running down his chin, staining his clothes, marking him as different, as damaged, as less than human. His mother rules in his name, signing documents, receiving ambassadors, making decisions. She surrounds herself with advisors who share her interests, her ambitions, her fears. The court divides into factions, the Queen's party, the King's party, the party of those who wait for Charles to die and the succession to be settled. The child sits at the center of this whirlwind, confused, frightened, aware only that everyone watches him, waits for him, wants something from him. In 1675, Charles turns 14, the age of majority. The regency ends and he assumes personal rule. But what does personal rule mean for a boy who cannot read, cannot write, cannot speak clearly? He signs what his ministers put before him, agrees to what they propose, nods when they tell him to nod. The kingdom runs itself as kingdoms do, while the king sits in the palace, playing with toys, staring at the walls, waiting for meals that he cannot chew. His teeth, those that remain, are pulled one by one. The pain is constant, a low throb that never leaves him. He eats only soft foods, porridge, soups, bread soaked in milk, because anything else causes agony. His body, already frail, grows weaker with each passing year. The physicians shake their heads and mutter about humors, about astrological influences, about the will of king. They do not mention the blood. They never mention the blood. The question of marriage arises. Charles must produce an heir, everyone knows this, but who would marry such a creature? The courts of Europe, once eager to ally with Spain, now hesitate. The French propose a bride, Marie-Louise of Orleans, niece of Louis XIV. She is young, beautiful, healthy, everything Charles is not. The marriage contract is signed, the dispensation obtained, the bride dispatched. Marie-Louise arrives in Madrid in 1679, a girl of 17 about to marry a man of 18 who looks like an old man. When she first sees Charles, she bursts into tears. He stands before her, his jaw jutting, his mouth open, his eyes watery and weak. He tries to smile, to welcome her, but the smile is a grimace, a distortion of what a smile should be. She weeps, and the court pretends not to notice. The marriage is never consummated. Charles cannot. The physicians are vague about why, but the result is clear. Marie-Louise lives in the palace, lonely and miserable, writing letters to her grandmother in France, begging for news from home. She dies in 1689 at 26, officially of fever, but possibly of poison, possibly of despair. The autopsy reveals a uterus too small to carry a child, a body unable to fulfill its function. She is buried in the Escorial, another Habsburg bride in the family crypt, another failure in the long history of failure. Charles marries again. This time the bride is Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess chosen for her fertility. Her mother has produced 17 children, surely she can produce one. She arrives in 1690, determined to succeed where Marie-Louise failed. She is aggressive, ambitious, convinced that she can save the dynasty. But the problem is not the bride. The problem is the groom. Charles, now 30, is a walking corpse. His body is covered in tumors. His joints swell with gout. His jaw, that monstrous jaw, makes eating a torture and speaking an ordeal. He cannot consummate the marriage, cannot produce the heir everyone demands. Maria Anna tries everything, potions, prayers, pilgrimages, but nothing works. The king remains impotent, childless, dying. The court divides again. The Austrian party wants the succession to pass to another Habsburg, a cousin from Vienna. The French party wants a Bourbon, Louis XIV's grandson. The Spanish nobles, those who remember their country's greatness, watch and wait, and prepare for the war that will surely come when Charles finally dies. Charles himself knows what they are doing. He is not stupid. His mind, trapped in his ruined body, remains sharp. He reads the dispatches, follows the negotiations, understands that his death will trigger a European war. He signs documents, receives ambassadors, plays the role of king while knowing that he is merely a placeholder, a ghost waiting to vanish. In 1696, Charles falls into one of his periodic declines. The physicians gather, consult, bleed him again. He rallies briefly, then sinks once more. His mother, the only person who ever loved him, died earlier that year. He is alone now, truly alone, surrounded by vultures waiting for him to fall. He dictates his will, then changes it again. First he leaves the throne to the Austrian candidate. Then, persuaded by French agents, he switches to the Bourbon. The document is sealed, witnessed, deposited in the royal archives. Charles signs with a trembling hand, his jaw hanging open, his breath coming in gasps. On November 1, 1700, Charles II of Spain dies. He is 38 years old. His body is opened for embalming, and the physicians who perform the autopsy record their findings with scientific detachment. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs were corroded, his intestines were putrefied and gangrenous. He had a single testicle, black as coal, and his head was full of water. They do not record the jaw. By now, the jaw is so familiar that no one notices it anymore. It is simply the Habsburg mark, the family trait, the thing that makes a Habsburg a Habsburg. They do not know that they are looking at the end of a line, at 2 centuries of inbreeding distilled into a single ruined body, at the price of empire paid in blood. The news spreads across Europe within days. In Vienna, the Austrian Habsburgs prepare for war. In Paris, Louis XIV accepts the inheritance on behalf of his grandson. In London, the English begin arming. The War of the Spanish Succession will last 13 years, kill hundreds of thousands, and redraw the map of Europe. But for one brief moment, there is silence. The silence of a dynasty ended, of a line broken, of a curse fulfilled. In the Escorial, the workmen prepare a new niche in the crypt. They measure the space, cut the stone, polish the marble. When they finish, they step back and look at their work. The niche is small, smaller than most, sized for a man who never grew to full height. They do not think about what it means. They only work. The body arrives in a lead coffin, carried by priests and soldiers. It passes through the gates, down the corridors, into the basilica where generations of Habsburgs have prayed. The monks chant the office for the dead, their voices rising and falling in the candlelight. The coffin is lowered into the niche, sealed with stone, forgotten. Above, in the palace, a new king prepares to take the throne. He is French, a Bourbon, his jaw normal, his health robust. The Habsburgs are finished in Spain. The jaw, that stubborn marker of blood, will never appear on a Spanish coin again. But in Vienna, the Austrian Habsburgs continue. Their jaw remains, still prominent, still visible, still marking each generation with the family curse. They will rule for another 2 centuries, marrying cousins, producing heirs, ignoring the ghost in their blood. They will not learn from Spain's example. They cannot. The dynasty requires it. The Hofburg Palace in Vienna hums with the quiet tension of a family that knows its time is running out. The year is 1740, and the man who lies dying in the imperial bedchamber is Charles VI, Holy Roman Emperor, last male Habsburg of the Austrian line. He has ruled for 29 years, fought wars, built palaces, patronized the arts. But his greatest struggle has been the one he cannot win, the struggle for an heir. His only son died in infancy, drowned in a cistern at the age of 7. An accident, the court said, though some whispered of poison. His daughters survived, 3 of them, but the Salic law that governs the empire forbids female succession. Charles has spent his reign trying to overturn that law, issuing decree after decree, extracting promises from the European powers, building a legal fortress around his daughter's claim. The pragmatic sanction, he calls it, a document that guarantees Maria Theresa's inheritance. As he lies dying, he asks for her. Maria Theresa comes to his bedside, a young woman of 23, already married to Francis Stephen of Lorraine, already pregnant with the first of the 16 children she will bear. She takes her father's hand, feels its coldness, listens to his labored breathing. He tries to speak, to warn her, to tell her what she will face, but the words will not come. He dies with his message unspoken. Maria Theresa becomes Archduchess of Austria, Queen of Hungary and Bohemia, ruler of the Habsburg domains. Within months, the promises extracted by the pragmatic sanction prove worthless. Frederick of Prussia invades Silesia, beginning a war that will last 8 years. Bavaria claims the imperial title. France allies with Prussia against the ancient enemy. The young queen, pregnant and terrified, faces a coalition that should crush her. But she has something her ancestors lacked, the ability to learn from their mistakes. She marries her children to foreign princes, not cousins. She welcomes new blood into the family, diluting the concentration that destroyed the Spanish line. Her jaw, the Habsburg jaw, is present but not grotesque, a slight prominence, a family trait rather than a family curse. She can chew, speak, close her mouth. She can rule. Maria Theresa's children spread across Europe. Marie Antoinette goes to France, where her jaw will become a caricature, a symbol of Austrian decadence. Leopold becomes Grand Duke of Tuscany, then Holy Roman Emperor. Ferdinand rules in Lombardy. Maria Carolina rules in Naples beside her husband. The Habsburgs, once so concentrated, now disperse, their blood mixing with Bourbons, with Wettins, with the ancient houses of Italy. But the jaw persists. It appears in Marie Antoinette's portraits, softened by the painter's brush, hidden by fans and gestures. It appears in Leopold's profile, more pronounced than his mother's, a reminder of what lurks in the blood. It appears in generation after generation, never quite disappearing, never quite dominating, a ghost that will not be exorcised. In 1765, Maria Theresa's husband dies suddenly, collapsing at the theatre after a performance. She is devastated. She loved him truly, as few royal couples love, but she has no time to mourn. There are children to marry, wars to fight, an empire to rule. She dresses in black and never removes it, wearing mourning for the rest of her life. She dies in 1780, at 63, surrounded by her children, her work complete. Her son Joseph inherits. He is an Enlightenment figure, a reformer, a man who believes that reason can solve every problem. He frees serfs, tolerates Protestants, suppresses monasteries. He also inherits the jaw, more pronounced now, a physical marker of the blood that will not dilute. He rules for 10 years, dying childless in 1790. The throne passes to his brother Leopold. Leopold II rules for 2 years, just long enough to continue the family tradition. He marries a Spanish Bourbon, produces 16 children, and dies suddenly in 1792. His son Francis inherits the throne just as the French Revolution explodes across Europe. Marie Antoinette, his aunt, goes to the guillotine. The ancient enemy, France, becomes something more terrifying than any Habsburg ever imagined. A republic, then an empire, led by a Corsican general who will redraw the map of Europe. Francis II is the last Holy Roman Emperor. In 1806, with Napoleon dominating Germany, he dissolves the 1,000-year-old empire and retreats to his hereditary domains. He becomes Francis I of Austria, emperor of a rump state, ruler of a diminished house. The jaw, still present, marks him as a Habsburg, even as the Habsburg world collapses around him. He marries twice, 4 times, seeking the heir who will continue the line. His first wife dies young. His second wife produces his heir, Ferdinand, born in 1793. The child's arrival is greeted with joy and with fear. Even as an infant, Ferdinand shows signs of the family curse. His jaw is pronounced, his head large, his limbs weak. He will grow into a man who cannot rule, cannot think, cannot function without constant assistance. Ferdinand I of Austria is the Spanish Charles II reborn. He has epilepsy, hydrocephalus, and the famous jaw. He cannot walk without support, cannot speak clearly, cannot understand the documents he is asked to sign. His father, Francis, rules through him, keeping him hidden from public view, protecting him from the world. When Francis dies in 1835, Ferdinand becomes emperor in name, but power passes to a council of advisors led by the brilliant but reactionary Metternich. Ferdinand's only pleasure is gardening. He tends the palace greenhouses with his own hands, planting, pruning, watering. He talks to the plants, names them, loves them. They do not judge him, do not plot against him, do not whisper about his jaw. They simply grow as he cannot, reaching toward the sun that warms them. In 1848, revolution sweeps Europe. The crowds in Vienna chant for freedom, for reform, for the removal of Metternich. They also chant against the emperor, the fool, the idiot who cannot rule. Ferdinand, watching from the palace windows, understands enough to be afraid. When his advisors suggest he abdicate in favor of his nephew Franz Joseph, he agrees immediately. "I will sign anything," he says, "so long as I can keep my greenhouses." He retires to Prague, where he lives another 27 years, tending his plants, reading his books, enjoying the peace that always eluded him as emperor. He dies in 1875, at 82, the longest-lived of all the Habsburgs. His jaw in death finally relaxes, finally closes, finally rests. Franz Joseph inherits a diminished empire. The revolutions of 1848 have been suppressed, but the forces they unleashed, nationalism, liberalism, democracy, continue to erode Habsburg power. He rules for 68 years, the longest reign in Austrian history, watching his world crumble piece by piece. He loses wars to France, to Prussia, to Italy. He loses his wife to an assassin's knife. He loses his son to suicide at Mayerling. He loses his heir, his nephew Franz Ferdinand, to another assassin's bullet in Sarajevo, the bullet that starts the Great War. Through it all, the jaw persists. Franz Joseph's portraits show it clearly: the protruding lower face, the slightly open mouth, the family trait that will not fade. He is the last Habsburg to rule, the last to bear the weight of the dynasty on his shoulders. When he dies in 1916, in the midst of the war that will destroy his empire, the jaw is still there, a final mark of the blood that built and ruined his family. His great-nephew Charles inherits a losing war and a crumbling empire. He tries to make peace, to save what can be saved, but it is too late. In 1918, the empire collapses. The Republic is declared. Charles goes into exile, first to Switzerland, then to Madeira, where he dies of pneumonia in 1922 at 34. His jaw, the Habsburg jaw, is still visible, still marking him as one of the tribe. In the crypt of the Capuchin Church in Vienna, the Habsburgs lie in their copper coffins, row after row, generation after generation. Maria Theresa is there, and Franz Joseph, and Ferdinand with his plants. Charles, the last emperor, was brought back from Madeira in 1922 and placed among his ancestors. Their bones rest in the darkness, undisturbed, unvisited except by tourists who pay a small fee to walk among the dead. Scientists have studied these bones, measured the jaws, calculated the inbreeding coefficients. They have confirmed what the portraits suggest: that the Habsburgs were the most inbred dynasty in European history, that Charles II of Spain was more homozygous than a child born of brother-sister incest, that the famous jaw was a symptom of a much deeper genetic disorder. They have published their findings in journals, presented them at conferences, added them to the growing literature on the genetics of power. But the bones themselves say nothing. They lie in their copper coffins, jawbones prominent, teeth missing, silent as the grave. They have no stories to tell, no lessons to impart. They are simply what remains when the dynasty ends, when the blood stops flowing, when the jaw finally closes for the last time. Outside the crypt, the world moves on. Tourists take selfies, buy souvenirs, eat ice cream. They do not think about the blood that built their world, the inbreeding that destroyed a dynasty, the ghost that swims in every family tree. They do not think about the jaw. They do not know that they carry their own ghosts, their own recessive traits, their own genetic time bombs waiting for the right marriage to detonate. The Habsburgs are dead. Long live the jaw. The laboratory in Santiago de Compostela is quiet, lit by the cold glow of computer screens and the hum of sequencing machines. Dr. Gonzalo Alvarez, a geneticist with a passion for history, sits before a bank of monitors, scrolling through data that would mean nothing to a historian and everything to a biologist. He is studying the Habsburgs, not their battles or their marriages, but their DNA. He wants to know what killed them. The samples are hard to come by. Royal bones are protected, sacred, off-limits to scientists with scalpels and sequencers. But Alvarez has found a way. He analyzes pedigrees, family trees, the paper trail of marriages and births that stretches back 5 centuries. He calculates inbreeding coefficients, tracks the transmission of recessive traits, models the probability of genetic disorders. He does not need the bones. The bones are just confirmation. What he finds stuns even him. The Habsburgs, he calculates, were the most inbred dynasty in European history. Their family tree is not a tree at all. It is a circle, a loop, a snake eating its own tail. Uncles married nieces, cousins married cousins, aunts married nephews. The blood that should have refreshed itself with each generation instead grew more concentrated, more dangerous, more lethal. Charles II of Spain, the last Spanish Habsburg, had an inbreeding coefficient higher than a child born of an incestuous brother-sister union. His genome was more homozygous, more identical on both sides than any human being ever measured. He was, in genetic terms, the product of generations of self-fertilization, a living embodiment of the dynasty's determination to keep its blood pure. Alvarez publishes his findings in 2009, and the world pays attention. The story of the Habsburg jaw, that grotesque protrusion that marked the family for centuries, becomes a cautionary tale about the dangers of inbreeding. Newspapers run headlines. Documentaries air. The public, fascinated by the intersection of royalty and science, cannot get enough. But Alvarez knows that his work is just beginning. The jaw is only a symptom. The real story lies in the DNA, in the recessive disorders that accumulated over generations, in the slow genetic collapse that turned a dynasty of conquerors into a line of invalids. The jaw itself is a condition known as mandibular prognathism, a protrusion of the lower jaw that prevents the teeth from meeting, distorts the face, and interferes with speech and eating. It is caused by a combination of genetic factors, some dominant, some recessive, some influenced by environment. In the Habsburgs, it was almost certainly inherited from multiple ancestors, amplified by repeated intermarriage, until it became the family's defining feature. But the jaw was not the only problem. Charles II suffered from a host of other disorders: intellectual disability, epilepsy, digestive problems, impotence. His autopsy revealed a body riddled with abnormalities: a shrunken heart, corroded lungs, gangrenous intestines, a single testicle. These were not random afflictions. They were the predictable result of generations of inbreeding, the accumulation of recessive disorders that would have been harmless if the blood had been refreshed. Modern geneticists have identified several specific conditions that probably afflicted the Habsburgs. Combined pituitary hormone deficiency explains the short stature, the delayed development, the impotence. Distal renal tubular acidosis explains the digestive problems, the kidney stones, the early deaths. Both are recessive disorders, requiring 2 copies of the defective gene to manifest. In a normal population, they are rare. In the Habsburgs, they were almost inevitable. The Austrian Habsburgs, who continued to rule for 2 centuries after the Spanish line died out, learned nothing from their cousin's fate. They continued to marry within the family, continued to concentrate their blood, continued to produce children with the famous jaw. Maria Theresa, the great reformer, married her cousin Francis Stephen. Her son Leopold married a Spanish Bourbon, another cousin. Her grandson Francis married twice within the family before seeking fresh blood elsewhere. The jaw persisted. Portraits of Franz Joseph, the last long-reigning Habsburg, show it clearly: the protruding lower face, the slightly open mouth, the family trait that would not fade. By his time, the jaw was milder than in the Spanish line. Generations of outbreeding had diluted it somewhat, but it was still there, still visible, still marking each Habsburg as a member of the tribe. Why did they continue? Why did a family with such clear evidence of the dangers of inbreeding persist in the practice? The answer lies in the nature of dynasty itself. Marrying within the family preserved power, kept lands together, prevented the fragmentation that had destroyed so many royal houses. Marrying outside the family meant sharing power, dividing territories, risking the unity that the Habsburgs had spent centuries building. The choice was between genetic health and political power. They chose power. And it killed them. The story of the Habsburg jaw resonates beyond the family itself. It speaks to something universal, something hidden in every human lineage. We all carry recessive genes, dangerous mutations, potential disorders that would destroy us if we married our cousins. The Habsburgs are not a freak show, they are a warning. They show us what happens when a closed system stays closed too long. Modern genetics has made this warning more urgent. We now know that every human carries an average of 1 to 2 recessive lethal mutations, genes that, if paired with an identical copy, would kill or severely disable the child who inherited them. In a large, outbred population, these mutations never meet. They drift through the gene pool, harmless, invisible. But in a small, inbred population, they find each other. They combine, they kill. The Habsburgs were an extreme case, but they were not unique. The pharaohs of Egypt married their sisters for centuries. The Ptolemies followed the same practice. The royalty of Hawaii, the Inca emperors, the Japanese imperial family, all practiced endogamy, all concentrated their blood, all paid the price in stillbirths, deformities, early deaths. The Habsburg jaw is just the most visible example of a universal phenomenon. In 2019, a team of Spanish scientists publishes a follow-up to Alvarez's study. They have analyzed portraits of Habsburg rulers, measuring the degree of prognathism in each, correlating it with inbreeding coefficients. The correlation is striking. The more inbred the ruler, the more pronounced the jaw. The line rises steadily from Maximilian to Charles II, then drops abruptly when the Spanish line ends. The graph tells the story more clearly than any words. But the scientists also find something else. The jaw, they discover, is not a simple Mendelian trait. It is polygenic, influenced by multiple genes, each contributing a small effect. The Habsburgs did not inherit a jaw gene from a single ancestor. They inherited a combination of genes from multiple ancestors, amplified by inbreeding until the combination became visible, became dominant, became destructive. This finding has implications beyond history. It suggests that many complex traits, height, intelligence, disease susceptibility, are similarly polygenic, influenced by thousands of variants working together. It suggests that inbreeding does not just expose single-gene disorders, it amplifies the entire genetic load, making everything worse, weakening the organism in ways we are only beginning to understand. The last Habsburg in the male line dies in 1961. Otto von Habsburg, son of the last emperor, lives into the 21st century, dying in 2011 at 98. His jaw in photographs is normal. Generations of outbreeding have erased the family trait. He sits in the European Parliament, a democratic politician, a citizen like any other. The dynasty that once ruled the world now sends a representative to argue about agricultural subsidies. His son Karl, born in 1961, carries the name but not the power. He works as a journalist, a politician, an advocate for European unity. When asked about the family history, he speaks carefully, acknowledging the past without dwelling on it. The jaw in his photographs is unremarkable. The ghost has faded. But the ghost is not gone. It lurks in the DNA, in the recessive genes that still circulate in the population, waiting for the right combination to manifest. Every human carries such ghosts. Every family tree has its loops, its hidden connections, its forgotten cousins. The Habsburgs are not a cautionary tale about the past. They are a warning about the future. In the El Escorial, the crypt remains. The coffins lie in their niches, row after row, generation after generation. Tourists file past, reading the plaques, taking photographs, trying to feel something for these long-dead kings and queens. They cannot. The dead are too distant, too strange, too other. But one tourist, a young woman with a degree in genetics, stops before the niche of Charles II. She reads the dates, 1661 to 1700, and thinks about what those 38 years meant. She thinks about the pain, the isolation, the constant awareness of being different. She thinks about the mother who held him, the wives who failed to bear his children, the courtiers who waited for him to die. She thinks about the jaw. She touches the marble, cold and smooth, and feels something she cannot name. Not pity, pity is too simple. Not horror, horror is too easy. Something else, something deeper, something that connects her to this ruined king across 3 centuries of separation. We are all carriers, she thinks. We all have ghosts in our blood. The only difference is that his ghosts found each other. She turns away from the niche and walks toward the light, leaving the dead to their silence. Outside, the Spanish sun blazes, indifferent, eternal. The jaw is forgotten. The dynasty is dust. The blood, that stubborn river, flows on.